I really love that the new Starbucks in the library is in circulation. That just seems fitting to me in so many ways. So welcome to the 10th Annual Eastern North Carolina Literary Homecoming. And today promised another slate of really stimulating topics and workshops, as you've seen by looking at the program, on this year's theme of a state of change, a changing state. I have the pleasant duty of thanking sponsors for this event. Those of you who were here last night and enjoyed that evening, we thank our sponsors. But for those of you who weren't there, I want to make sure you know that we're being well supported here at the university and in the community. So first, the ECU Division of Academic Affairs and Provost Marilyn Shearer has been very supportive. ECU Division of Research and Graduate Studies and Interim Vice Chancellor Ron Mitchelson has also been wonderfully supportive throughout the years, including this one. The David Julian and Virginia Souther Witcher Distinguished Professorship in the Humanities and the current Witcher Chair Gary Stringer have contributed to this event. Joiner Library, of course, and Interim Dean Jan Lewis, thank you very much for your support. The Department of English, the Friends of Joiner Library, and the Friends of Shepherd Library. These distinguished groups have been wonderful to this event over the years. And finally, this morning, special thanks to Krispy Kreme for contributing donuts and coffee, and we need that this morning. So please join me in a quick round of applause for our sponsors. I would be remiss having this chance if I didn't also take a moment to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Margaret Bauer. You all know how instrumental she is to organizing this event. She doesn't do it alone. She's quick to say that, but Margaret is the driving spirit. Margaret's tireless efforts, her infectious energy, and her passion for promoting and celebrating North Carolina writers is a grand thing, and we're honored to have someone like her working in our department and certainly helping us with this event. So please give Margaret a hand if you would. My last pleasant duty this morning is to introduce another friend and colleague, Liza Whelan, who is moderating our first panel. And so a few brief words about Liza. You should know, if you don't already, that Liza herself is a highly accomplished award-winning author. And if you're unfamiliar with her novels and stories, you really do need to correct that error. She is an outstanding writer, and her work is just captivating. I like reading this. I like this one quote Liza has, so I don't know where she's delivered it. I don't know if it's an interview or a newspaper. I found it on one of her book jackets, but I love this quote. She said about her writing that it seems to me there's no such thing as the whole truth, except in fiction. News, history, fact, all masquerade as truth, but for me, Liza explains, they never tell the whole story. And believe me, when Liza tells us the truth in her work, she does so with compelling beauty, even and perhaps especially when that truth is almost too much for us to bear. Please join me in welcoming Liza.
I'd like to call forth my panelists to join me here. And I'm going to introduce them briefly, each of them, and ask a general question to which I'd like them to respond, and they already know what it is because it's the question of this panel. And then I have, should discussion flail, although I imagine it won't, some other questions to ask. And at the end of the session, well, towards the end of the session, I'll leave time for questions from you all. So that's sort of how we're going to proceed. In case you don't remember, Tarheel literature in black and white. And my panelists here are first Anjail Ahmad, who's an associate professor of English and director of the creative writing program at North Carolina A&T State, a poet and disability rights advocate. She lost her eyesight in 1998 while completing her doctoral studies at the University of Missouri but she returned to the university after a 2-year hiatus. Her collection of poems, Necessary Kindling, was a finalist for the Mill Kessler Book Award. She is also the recipient of numerous other awards, including 2 Janet Preston Prizes for poetry from the Academy of American Poets. Her poems have appeared in African American Review, The Black Scholar, Midland's Icon, and elsewhere. In 2005-2006, Ahmad served as the Distinguished Gilbert Chapel Poet of the North Carolina Poetry Society. In 2006, she founded Black Ink Writers Workshop for writers of the African diaspora. Wiley Cash grew up in Gastonia, North Carolina. He received his BA in Literature from the University of North Carolina, Asheville, with an MA in English from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and a PhD in English from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. So he moved east and then south. So, his debut novel, A Land More Kind Than Home, beautiful novel, was a New York Times bestseller in both hardcover and paperback, and was featured on Best of 2012 lists by the New York Times, Library Journal, Kirkus Review, and others. He was a Barnes & Noble Discover Selection and an Indie Next pick. He has received grants and fellowships from the Asheville Area Arts Council, the Thomas Wolfe Society, McDowell Colony, and Yale. He and his wife currently live in West Virginia, and he teaches in the low residency MFA program at Southern New Hampshire State University. But he doesn't live in West Virginia anymore.
Not anymore.
No. Anna Jean Mayhew, Anjail, is a native of Charlotte. She has been both production editor of a major medical journal and editor of a science fiction fan magazine, so she's everywhere. In earlier careers, she ran a court reporting agency and worked in opera management. I think it would be hard-pressed to find a more diverse writer here. Mayhew has been a member of the same writing group since 1987 and now leads 2 groups herself. Her first novel, The Dry Grass of August, received the Sir Walter Raleigh Award for Fiction in 2011, and I've just been made to understand that it's been translated into
Polish, French, Italian, and Turkish.
Wow.
Wonderful.
Yes, congratulations. She's working on a second novel currently titled Tomorrow's Bread. Calvin Alexander Ramsey was raised in Roxborough, North Carolina. He's the author of 12 plays, including 3 musicals and 2 children's books. He is the recipient of the Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Justice Award and has served on the Georgia Council for the Arts Theater panel. For 5 years, he served on Woodruff Library's Advisory Committee on Manuscript and Rare Books at Emory University. He's now a member of the Paul Green Foundation Advisory Board. His play, Kanata Lee, was read most recently at La Mama, etc. in New York City. The Green Book, a 2-act play about the difficulties African Americans faced while traveling during the Jim Crow era, was performed by Theatrical Outfit in Atlanta in 2011. So, the question at hand is, how did growing up in a society fragmented by racial issues influence your work? Good morning, everyone. I've been thinking about this question since we first received it, and I had to ask myself, do I write about race? And if so, how? And as a person of color, I generally don't think of myself as writing about race. On occasion, I write poetry, so sometimes I take that issue up. But in general, I'm just writing about my life experience in America. And it makes me wonder where that comes from, the designation that I'm writing about race, particularly when the particular work is not about that per se. I think that because we don't, as a culture, we don't really deal with race as a society, it throws it to the individuals to encounter it as we do.
I wonder, because we don't engage so much on these topics, that we get the labeling, so-and-so is writing about race. It happens that when there's a conversation about race, it seems to be drawn to people of color to talk about it as though we own it. It's our purview. So I think that has an influence on it. I'm writing the American story. It's how I see it. And it's a version of the American story because there is no one American story. That's how I see it. And when I think about it and reference it, it's a version of the American story. And from a writer who happens to be an African American. And that associates me with a particular history. And so that experience will reflect that, just as a matter of course. I don't have to intend it, it will happen. When I was working on my bachelor's, I signed up for a course. It was a survey of African American literature. And one thing I did was take time out to read the table of contents. And what was amazing to me was how I fit into that anthology, the work that I was doing. It wasn't intentional, but being within the African American context, my living, my history, it wedded me to that literature through my experience. And so I think from my perspective, I think that's a valid point of view around that issue. Because in reading literature, American literature, often there's underrepresentation of certain voices. I feel compelled to represent those voices. Like nowadays, I have blindness. I haven't always been blind. So in the canon, I don't see many voices reflecting that experience. So of late, I've been writing about those topics because people are curious, and there's a lot of ignorance about how to deal with that aspect of life when people come upon persons with disability. So I think in a similar way, when navigating the society, you're treated in certain ways that don't feel so good. There's a natural tendency to try to write something that will help dispel the misunderstanding that may be going on, that will close those gaps. So that's what I'll have to say about that for the moment. Thank you.
Just a disclaimer, that was much more eloquent than I'm able to be at this point in the morning in the day. But I really appreciate what she said about discussions of race seem to fall to people of color as if that is their job to deal with. And I've been thinking about that a lot, not in terms of race, but just in terms of people other than myself. There's a certain ease that comes with being a white man in America, and that's something that I have no trouble admitting, because my wife is an attorney, and I've watched her struggle in this world, this profession dominated by men, where she goes to work and she goes to court. She wants to look nice, but she doesn't want to look sexy. She wants to seem in charge, but forgive my language, she doesn't want to seem bitchy. And so it's always navigating this room. And I think it goes back to what Du Bois calls double consciousness from Souls of Black Folk, this two-ness of always having to see yourself in two particular ways, where as I just go into a room and just kind of show up, plop down and say, hey, how are you doing? You know, I never think about, you know, do I seem too masculine? Am I coming across as too white today? You know, that's never on my radar. I never have to be responsible for that. And so I'm really interested in my first book certainly doesn't reflect that, although one of my narrators is an elderly woman in a landmark kind of home, and I call it the help syndrome, for those of you who have read or seen The Help. Whenever you have a female narrator speaking any kind of dialect, it will automatically assume she's African American. So I have this elderly woman from the mountains of North Carolina in Madison County, where if you've been to Madison County, you know she is definitely not African American. She is as a white woman, but a lot of people have mistaken her identity, her racial identity. But my second novel deals with race in ways that my life has dealt with race, which is in ways where you find yourself brushing up against it. So, for example, the two sisters who are in this foster home, the majority of children that are in this home with them are African American. And their father comes and finds them after school one day, and they say, we're living in a foster home. He says, well, great. He says, y'all are going to be the next ones to be adopted, I just know. And the little girl, Easter, says, who I read from last night, she says, how do you know we'll be the next one to be adopted? And he looks out at the baseball field where all the kids are playing kickball, and he says, because you're white. And she has never thought about it that way, because she's only 12. And in the novel, she has a boyfriend who's also 12. His name's Marcus, and he's an African-American boy, and he sneaks over to her room at night. I'm not giving away too much of the book to where you won't read it now. You're like, I already know what happened. That's not part of the plot. That's incidental to the plot. But there's a moment where the father kidnaps the two girls and takes them down to Myrtle Beach, the redneck Riviera. That's the first place you go. I guess when you flee Gastonia, you head for Myrtle Beach. And the little girls have never seen the beach before. And so he takes them out there, and he's blowing up this raft, and they're all excited. They know it's a raft. And when he gets it blown up, Easter sees that it has a Confederate flag on the raft. And she says, I'm not playing with that raft. And he says, why not? She says, it's got a Confederate flag on it. And he said, what's wrong with the Confederate flag? And Marcus's, her boyfriend's father, has told him that if you fly the Confederate flag, it means that you don't like black people. And so she tells her dad that. She says, I don't want to play with it on the beach. It means you don't like black people. He says, that's not what it means. She says, what does it mean? And he holds it back and he looks at it and he says, I don't know. That's not what it means. And that's kind of the answer that we hear a lot, that I hear a lot from my friends who are, shackled to this image of, we just like it, I don't know. And what's really ironic is I've been living in West Virginia for 5 years, a state that is created and revolt against the Civil War and slavery and the rise of the Confederacy, and people there could fly the Confederate flag. And I'm like, you really don't know what it means. This is antithetical to your existence. And so I'm interested in race in ways that that I don't have to be interested in it in my public life. And I'm interested in putting my characters in situations where they are the minority, where they're called upon to make these connections and this understanding and seeing their lives in a way that they rarely are called upon to see it, and question things that they're rarely called upon to question it. So.
I'm a native of Charlotte, North Carolina. I was born there in 1940. Lived there until I was 45, and at that time I moved to Orange County to find out if I could bear the life of a writer, being alone and sitting and facing a blank page or a blank screen. And what prompted me most, once I put myself in a place where I could write, was Charlotte. I wanted to write about growing up there. And I found out later this happens with a lot of writers. I couldn't do it when I was up close. I had to get back some. And all I wanted to write about was my experience growing up in the segregated South. And that's still true today. My first novel is set in August of 1954, 3 months after the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board, where an integrated car goes through the Deep South. Wasn't a real smart thing to do. The underlying theme, and I'm delighted when I hear about the theme of this weekend, is that resistance to change will break us if it doesn't kill us. And I was really wedded to that theme. Now I'm working on my second book, and it's set in Charlotte 7 years later. And it's about urban renewal when a historically black neighborhood was wiped off the face of the earth. And now the theme is sometimes you should resist change. And I've gone back to Charlotte and interviewed people who lived through it, people of color who lived in that neighborhood. And they didn't resist. They didn't fight. I don't think they knew they could. The city used eminent domain and came in and took the land and said, you've got 30 days to find a place to live. Those themes come from growing up very white. I grew up in a white household. The only people of color I knew were the people who worked for my family. And we did have a bathroom in the basement. It's in my first book for the help. And when I found out that house had been torn down, I found that out about 8 or 10 years ago, I was sad. I grew up there, I missed it, and I thought, what happened to my home? And then later I thought, that bathroom's gone, and I was glad of that. Last night, I asked Jan Lewis, not realizing she was dean, if she could get a copy of Lyrics from Cottonland from the Joyner Library. Did y'all have it here? And I was, number one, blown away that you did have it. It's a fairly obscure book of poetry. And then she brought it and let me have it for this morning. And she said, when you check in tomorrow, it's probably going to beep when you go through the door, because she didn't check it out. And she said, if it does, just tell them that Dean Jan Lewis said you had it. I'm going, Dean. So thank you very much, Jan, wherever you are, for getting this book for me. When we traveled, when I was a little girl, we did two things in the car. We told stories and we sang. And one of the things my father did was recite by heart poems from this book. And it was my first understanding that there was literature and poetry in a black voice. I thought John Charles McNeill was black because of the poems that Daddy read to us, which are in a black dialect. He's not, he wasn't, he was white. And he, on his gravestone, was given the honorary title of Poet Laureate of North Carolina. I don't think that was ever official. So, to me, I could not write and just write white. It wouldn't be my story. My mother's family are Swiss. My first trip to Switzerland in 1987, I got out of the airport and got into the countryside, and I did feel a connection. I felt like in some rooted way I was home. But there was one thing that made me very uncomfortable. I did not see one single person of color. I have since married a Swiss. And when we go back, now I do see people of color, a few, who have come in and settled in Switzerland. But I realized back in '87, this is not normal. This isn't my life. And as to the question, and I've been I've been asked often about my entitlement as a white woman to write black characters and to write black dialogue. I don't have any defense for that because I don't think it needs defending. I'm writing my story and I'm writing my life experience. My next novel, one of my chief characters is a black man. And I'm very comfortable with him. In fact, he has come out the most easily. The one I'm struggling with the most is a white woman who is the most like me. And I'm really having difficulty with her. I mean, I sometimes want to whack her up the side of the face and say, get straight. You know, get with the program. But the two black characters there are four major characters, two black and two white. The two black characters have just flowed out of me. And I have to trust that they are honest depictions of who they are. My last bit of this is that when I was in 1972, I was 32, I took a couple of classes at UNC Charlotte, and I met a woman in the class who was my age, who had kids like the age of my kids, And we sort of hung out together because we were in our 30s and everybody else was 18. And she became a really dear friend. And so Margot and I decided one day to take our kids to the public swimming pool. Margot is African American. And we got there, and the man at the gate said, "I will close this place down before I let you in." And we had our kids with us. So we didn't protest, we left. That event was life-changing for me. And that's when my eyes opened that this was a really unequal society that I was living in, that I had grown up in. And I couldn't write without writing about it. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My writing career started, this is a lot different from most people here. I was born in Baltimore. My dad went on strike. He was still working. He moved back to his hometown in Roxborough, North Carolina. That's where I grew up. My 7 siblings and went to school there. And my group was, I was one of the first to integrate with the public schools in Roxborough. But when I left Roxborough, I went back to Maryland, went to college. And I worked in all kinds of fields before I started writing. I was in advertising, worked in newspapers, spent a little time in Chapel Hill, working in the print shop there, under the bookstore. Drove a taxi in Chapel Hill. And the blue taxi, the Carolina blue taxi, that thing is still there. And then I got in my head, I said, well, I need to go to California. So I sort of hitchhiked halfway there, and then I rode buses the other half, and got out to California. I started taking classes at UCLA, and screenwriting. So I was going to write Great Mark, this movie. And I wrote a screenplay about an African-American guy going to the Caribbean and writing this cross-cultural screenplay about what it's like being black, going to the Caribbean island and meeting up black people there and seeing our differences. And after I turned it into a few people, they said, well, you've never been there. You need to go there. And so I said, I don't want to leave Southern California because I was having so much fun. But I left. So I moved to St. Croix, and I ended up running a bar down there for 2 years. And interviewing people, and they said, you got to stop interviewing us and just live among us. So after 2 years running a bar, that wasn't getting me anywhere. Cruise ship people would come in, and they all want pina coladas. Your hands are frozen, and and then the British Navy would come in, and the Canadian Navy, the American Navy, and I was at Frederickstead, which has a very deep port. Then I realized that was not going to work, so I ended up. My girlfriend didn't like St. Croix. She thought it was a little too masculine, a little too rough, and so we moved to St. John, and I ended up there for a year, and I commuted every day to St. Thomas. And after a year doing accounts payable work, I moved to New York City with my oldest brother there. And in New York, I moved to Martha's Vineyard, where I was doing substitute teaching for 2 years, painting houses and doing what I used to do to stay up there, in the long winters. Then I moved back to North Carolina and got married. Then I realized I really wanted to see if I could write. I had all the furnish now to write, but it still wasn't coming, and so now I was in the insurance business. And,
Not diverse.
and so after the insurance business, I moved down to Atlanta and worked for Affleck at the Dutch. And for almost 20 years, and this very nice lady, this little white lady, she said, you need to be on Emory's advisory board, special collections. And I didn't know what special collections are about, rare book collections. She said, I really want to push people on this board. And I didn't have a clue what that was all about. But once I got on there, and all these archivists was there, and historians and scholars, and they didn't want this insurance guy on there at all, because I didn't know anything. But what I did know was these stories there. They had Ralph and Gill papers and Carl Sandburg papers, and to me this was just, this treasure chest of information. And so from there I started writing. And my first play was about a woman in Bricktop. They had a papers there. And Bricktop was a legendary performer in Paris. During the same time, Josephine Baker was there. She was African American. She was a redhead freckled lady, and they all called Bricktop. She had a nightclub there, and and everyone would come there. Cole Porter was there almost every night, and Gene O'Neill, and Hemingway, Picasso, and so all these folks would come there because she had this real, and Django Reinhardt was in her house band, and Stephen Capelli. So to me, this was just a marvelous story. So I wrote a play about it. And then I had to go out and find a composer to help with music, and one thing led to another. So we did the play in Atlanta. Then the play went to Metro Stage in Alexandria, Virginia. From there it went to San Francisco. And now we're pushing it to, in Alliance Française, the French language school in most major cities, trying to get the play over to Paris. So we're working on that. But it's about an African-American lady who goes to Paris between the two wars, and what she experiences in Paris, the freedom that she could not experience in Chicago, New York, where she actually grew up. She's actually born in Virginia. And so my second play, which also came out of special collections of memory, called Greenville. And Greenville is a travel guide for African Americans during the Jim Crow years, some of the Jim Crow years. And Victor Green, who was a mailman out of Harlem, started this travel guide. And from 1936 to 1964, he published this book. Him being a mailman, he had other mailmen around the country. They had folks on their routes, African-American mailmen, would ask people on their routes about safe places to stay and eat, beauty shops, doctors. So it was our version of the AAA travel guide. So we could not belong to AAA. So this was all we had. And so I wrote a play about that. And also I included a Holocaust survivor in the play, who's from Buchenwald. And that play was done in Atlanta. We had a world premiere there. And I did a reading of it up at Yale for that, at Hebrew University College in Baltimore. So I was trying to show how the races, the groups back then, the Jewish people and the black people, early 50s, they worked together in the civil rights legislation, and marched together, worked together, and how things divided, in the 70s. And that's my second play. My third play was I spoke to folks last night called Johnny Mercer. Johnny Mercer is the lyricist from Savannah, but he grew up, the dad was a lawyer. He grew up basically, and he had black housekeepers at his home. He worked on the yard. But he hung on the black side of town all the time. And he was fascinated with Louis Armstrong and Monterey and that type of thing. And also John Coltrane music. But he really wrote in almost white dialect. So his papers were at Georgia State University. And by this time I had really become an expert on special collections. When I go to a town, first thing I do is instead of going to a ballpark, I said, gee, I wonder what they have in the special collections. I went out to San Francisco and I went over to Cal Berkeley because they had the Mark Twain papers. And so I called and said, I used to be on the image board, special collections. And so he said, come on over, So, and so anyway, Johnny Mercer papers at Georgia State. No one was using these papers at all. There's 4 Academy Awards down there. And so I started going through the paperwork and they said, Calvin, it's wonderful what you're doing, but they never allow you to do a play about Johnny Mercer. They turn down everyone, who ever tried to do anything on Johnny Mercer. So I moved ahead, and when I got time to really present myself to the Johnny Mercer Foundation in New York, they invited me up. And they were already turning me down for doing this, this musical. And they said, well, why should we allow you to do this? And I said, well, I'm going to do it from a black perspective. And they said, well, Johnny would approve of that. And they allowed me to do the play. And so I did the play at Atlanta, and also did it where he went to school at Woodbury Forest, up in Virginia, Wood School. And so I kind of mix race and popular culture and try to do it in a way that's not so sad. Try to, like the Green Book is an uplifting story about men and women who were male characters who got together to unright or wrong, for travel, for accommodation. And the audience leaves out feeling a little good about themselves. Rick Top is kind of uplifting. It's joyous, even though she's there, and she had to leave because the Second World War was started, and Germany was coming into Paris. And Mercer tells us he went through all of this stuff, started Capitol Records. One of the first persons that we hired was Nat King Cole. And I write about that relationship, their relationship. So I mix it up, but I try to give the audience a little different perspective on it, so they can feel a little bit about young people, to them it's a matter of fairness. If Ruth is traveling, Ruth in Greenville, she's traveling. If they see something that's not right, they don't always see it as a racial thing, they see it as a fairness issue. So I try to approach some of the things like that as well.
Does that inspire any commentary from you all? What you heard? Okay. Well, the next question, or topic, I think maybe some of you answered really. But when I was first starting out as a fiction writer, my first novel was about child murders in Atlanta, and I had a conversation with the novelist Nancy Kincaid, who is white. I'll say that up front. And we had this conversation in the back room where all good conversations happen. And she said this to me. She said, the most important subject matter in America is race. And I thought that was remarkable. These two white women who had written books that dealt with race, and one of them made that statement. And I wonder what each of you would say about that. Agree, disagree, modify it. Is ethnicity also a concern, or is that sort of broad, but the most important issue topic? I'm just curious to know how you would respond.
Well, someone quoted from W.E.B. Du Bois, and he said that the problem for the 20th century was the color line. And I believe that has led over to the 21st century because we won't do the work, we won't have the discussions, we won't face the issues, so it doesn't get resolved. It's part of that answer depends on which generation you belong to. If you're from an older generation, maybe you see it that way, but Calvin said, our children are changing, and things that were obstacles in relating across cultural boundaries are less a problem for our children. And someone has said they're smarter. There are things that they get that they're able to. I think the story of the Israelites in the Bible, they were prevented from going exactly into the promised land. They had to linger there some 40 years for the old wood to die out, because the old wood would take the old mindset into the new land, and they have the same thing repeating itself. And there have been a lot of changes in race relations in the United States, and there is a difference in the younger people. Their ability to relate has greatly improved because of things they haven't experienced that hasn't tainted them, and maybe they know something of the history, but their experiences are very different. Their boundaries that they are in many ways allowed to cross or haven't been prevented from crossing, that makes the meeting of others a lot easier. So as long as we don't deal with it, it'll always be a primary thing that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, I would say race, obviously, certainly from Du Bois' perspective, was a problem in the 20th century. And I think, as she said, it's bleeding over to the 21st century, but it's interesting to me, my students, when I was teaching undergraduates, if I had undergraduates in 2008, that means they were born in, 1990. That's shocking to me. And so the first time they get to vote, they get to decide whether or not they want to vote for an African American candidate who's on a major party's ticket. And for them, that's like sun rises in the east, it sets in the west. That's the first experience voting. one of the candidates when I voted for the first time was Bob Dole, you know. And that's a shock to think about. For me, you know, I'm only 36, well, only 36, but for me, you know, Obama was a big deal. You know, those kind of things are a big deal, but for my students who are half my age, it wasn't that big a deal. And I like what Calvin said about these issues of race and equality for young people. It's just a matter of fairness. And it doesn't get as far as race or as deep as race or equality because it's just not right. And that's what I hope is going to be the prevailing sentiment in terms of equality and individual rights and equal rights in the 21st century are just issues of fairness, not issues of history or of these different philosophies or whatever kind of dogma we adhere to or others adhere to. But on the other hand, I don't want to live in a society where young people, students roll their eyes when you talk about issues of race as saying, why are you bringing up old stuff? Why do we need to know about this old stuff? Because I think that these stories, these struggles, these times where things weren't always, you know, the way they are now are just as important as the future. I think you don't want to be shackled to your past, but you do need to have your past with you as you move forward. You know, one eye looking ahead and one eye looking back to see how far you've come. And I think it's important to talk about these stories and to read these books and to continue to mine, as Calvin was saying, these special collections, to see these things that are part of this nation. Even as we, you know, pull the lever for these different candidates who we never could imagine pulling the lever for a decade ago.
I too would like to echo what Calvin said about fairness. I hope we are getting more and more in that direction, that when opportunities come along, you're not chosen because you are a woman or because you are black, but what your qualifications are, and that fairness will be the judge. I like that a lot. And then something that Wiley just mentioned triggered a memory for me. When I was working on the manuscript of Dry Grass of August, a young woman, 16, African American, volunteered to read it, volunteered through an older woman, a friend of hers, who knew about my book. And I had mentioned to the woman, I wish I could find a young black to read this manuscript and get their take on it. So she did. And she brought it back to me, and she took it seriously and took notes and really gave me a wonderful report. But the thing that startled me was she felt that my character of Mary Luther, who is 47, and she's a domestic in this white family's house, and this is 1954, and this teenager said that she felt I had made Mary into a female Uncle Tom. And I realized her experience, she was born, as you were saying, in maybe 1992 or 94, and she did not know that black women could not look at a white man in the eyes. And so they would speak with their face down, staring at the brain. And at first I was really disturbed by her take on that, and then I was gratified. Because I thought these children who think 1954 is ancient history can learn from this. The book has crossed over a little bit into young adult, and I had an occasion this past spring to speak at Chatham Middle School in Chatham County, which is an amazing school. I came away from there just thinking, we're doing something right. There were 40 kids there. I would say the preponderance were Hispanic. Maybe the next group would have been African American, and then 10 or so white kids. And they were just all mixed up in a room, not sitting according to the color, which I found also very gratifying. And this one boy just kept waving his hand and asking questions. And we ran over. I mean, it was an enthusiastic, wonderful experience. And so the teacher said, we got to quit now. And he's still waving his hand. She finally said, okay. And I'm thinking, oh, here comes the question that always happens with kids. Was it really what? But no, he asked me, did you really get caught under your parents' bed when they were doing it? if I am doing social history. And I hope that they will continue to do that. It is social history as I know it. And I'm not the authority on it. It's my law. Thanks.
When I go into schools, I have two children books. First book is Bell, the Last Eulogy, and that's the two mules that pulled Dr. King's case on during his funeral. And the mules came from deep in Alabama, where these women from the beautiful close to live and work. And they're supposed to travel all over the United States, and they really look, they are pieces of art. The first book is Bruce and Greenville. So when I go to some of these schools, public, private, Quaker schools, all kinds of schools, you know, I was in one school in Atlanta, and I was telling the kids about, you know, I remember those days of traveling and doing difficult periods. And a little girl asked me, had I ever seen a dinosaur? Because them is really easy. And I mean, it really wasn't that far ago. But I was one of the first 4 students that integrated schools in Roxborough. And my mother had a lot of her friends. My mother was a homemaker, she worked in the home. But her friends were, a lot of them were domestics, you know. And so I'd get home from school, and they would call my mom and said, and they would say things like, you know, where they worked, there were people in the home, people that they really reared and raised as their family as well, white kids. And they would call my mom and say, well, Bobby saw Calvin at school today, and he spoke to him and sat down with him and had lunch with him and all that. But no one spoke to me or sat with me at lunch. And so, but I didn't have a heart to tell my mom or these ladies that didn't happen because they were rearing these kids, you know. And so, and they felt so proud that these kids were reaching out to me, but I just couldn't tell them that, you know, that's not happening. And so this is going on every day. And I just always, now one day I may even write about that. I don't know, but
The next thing I want to ask you all is a question that's a little bit removed from the topic of the panel, but I think as a writer I'm always interested in this. I think the audience probably is too. It's sort of a two-part question. Who are your literary influences? Not necessarily as issues of race come up. So, you know, who do you feel influenced by? And I'm also interested, and I think the audience probably is too, how did you come to write in your primary genre? How did you come to be a fiction writer or a poet or a playwright? What about the genre spoke to you or compelled you? So, 2 questions. Literary influences. That's a hard question because they all bleed together now. I like reading fiction. I like the power to tell a tale, and I think poems should do that too. I love the work of Toni Morrison and her ability to tell stories and the depth at which she does that and the historical context that she weaves in to her work. And I think that's important because I think in general people don't see themselves as being a part of history. And so when you write work, I feel it's important to get that historical context somewhere in there. That's just how I feel about it. Being a person having felt written out of history, I feel like I have a special mood to write back in. And how I came to poetry. Poetry came to me. I had no interest in writing poetry. When I was at college the first time out of high school, I had an experience. I was walking across campus one spring day. It had been raining several days and the grounds were saturated. I had these really nice leather shoes that I was really proud of.
and I was walking across campus, and all of a sudden my foot was wet. And I thought, oh no, these are new shoes. And what happened for me was, there used to be a commercial for, I think, Certs breath mints. You know, breath mints. If you take the breath mint, you win. You get the girl, you get the guy. And this commercial was a breath mint. If you didn't take the breath mint, the person like moved backward in the scene real fast, almost as if they were shrinking. And what happened that day, as I was walking and my foot was suddenly wet, I was quickly transported back to being 9 or 10 years old and walking with shoes that had holes and cardboard, and my feet were wet and I couldn't escape it. And I was so smug at that point in my life that I turned around and ran all the way across campus till I reached my room and jumped in my seat and started writing a poem about that. I had never had an impulse like that before. And so that was pretty powerful for me. And that at that point I wrote 7 poems. I had never written any at all. And it was amazing that it happened. And during that period, that was in the 70s. It was a very fervent time. There's a lot of poetry in the environment, a lot of protest. So it got bitten by the bug. And later I drop out of school, and later I get married and get in life. Life can be like a vice grip. When it gets a hold of you, you come out looking for answers. And I was at that place in my life, having lived some, looking for answers. Why am I here? That sort of thing. What's the purpose of being here? And this experience I had, I'd be in the kitchen washing dishes, which can be a very mindless activity. Your mind drifts. And so I started hearing an internal dialogue, more or less a monologue. There's only one voice. And the first time it happened, I was shocked, and I ran to write it down after I finished, and I couldn't access it. And I promised to all the muses, if you just will whisper again, I promise I'll stop whatever I'm doing and write it down. And so I put some paper on the table and a pencil, and washed dishes, then on with a half mind of listening. And the next time it started up, I ran, dropped everything and ran and wrote it down. When I looked at the little strips, I had put strips of paper, and I read them. They were more like aphorisms, they weren't poems. But I read them and said, these things make sense. I think these are messages to me. They're helping me clarify something. That was the first seduction. And over time, I continued. At some point, I want to write. At first, these are invasions into my private world. A kind of nuisance. I have to drop everything and go write it down. Then have to pay attention to it because it's telling me something. And then over time, there develops this hunger for that feeling of what it feels like to work with ideas and search for ideas and try to make something come together on the page. It was kind of like an automatic writing kind of experience. So that's how that came for me.
I started writing like many folks start writing. I was listening to The Doors. Junior high school, thinking about how nobody understood me and I was too smart for everybody. So I started reading the poetry of the great American bard Jim Morrison. And then I went to college at UNC Asheville because they had a major in creative writing. They were one of the few schools at that time that had a major track in creative writing. So I went to UNCA to continue my self-absorbed, doomy Gothic poetry about how nobody understood me. And I got to college and realized that not only was I'm a terrible poet. Jim Morrison was also a terrible poet. And I've been grossly misled, primarily by myself. But I liked writing, and I knew I wanted to do it. And so I liked storytelling. And I grew up around people who told stories and sat around and told stories, and so I gave storytelling a try. I think it was around that time that I read, she mentioned Toni Morrison a second ago, her novel Song of Solomon. And that was the first experience I'd had. I'd always grown up reading. In my household, we read a lot, but that was the first experience I had where I disappeared into a book and then stepped out of the book and then disappeared into it again. And the process of disappearing into the pages was such an amazing experience that I wanted to see if I could do that in terms of writing. Obviously not to the degree that she did it, but it was, to me, the perfect novel. And in many ways, I still think it's the most perfect novel I've ever read in terms of plot and character. So I started trying to write fiction. I'd say my greatest influences are, there's three books that I'm always kind of reading, that I always have a marker in or a bookmark in, or the pages dog-eared. One is Look Homeward Angel by Thomas Wolfe. I read that. I came to that late. I feel like a lot of people read Look Homeward Angel in junior high school because it's assigned, or they read it in college. I know a lot of guys read it during World War II, kind of as they were coming of age in the war, Eugene Gant's coming of age in the mountains of North Carolina. But I read it when I was 25, after I'd already had a little training, in literary studies and things like that. And so I just loved how the novel put me in North Carolina, especially when I was living in Louisiana. I desperately missed Western North Carolina, and so I would read Look Homeward Angel and imagine walking the streets of Altamont, Asheville, just like Eugene Gant does. One of the craziest or best moments I've had in this, academia, I suppose, is I was at the Wolfe Papers, visiting the Wolfe Papers at the Widener Library at Harvard, and I found a map. They have all of Wolfe's papers. They have 2 tons of his material at the Widener Library. And I found a map he'd drawn of downtown Asheville, and he'd written down all the street names, Merriman and Biltmore and Woodfin and all these things. And then he crossed them out and rewritten them as the streets he was going to call them in Look Homeward Angel. And it dawned on me that you can take a place that is and make it into the place that you either want it to be or the place that it is for you specifically. And that's what I tried to do with what I'm writing about. The second novel, or book, if you can call it a book, a novel, is Cain by Gene Toomer. It's a 1924 book, an experimental book, a very narrow, skinny book, probably 120 pages, about the African American experience in the South in terms of the Great Migration, of leaving a place like Sparta, Georgia, and then relocating to D.C. or to New York. And about, there's a part in the book where it says the Dixie Pike is a goat path to Africa, about going back to the South, the northern experience of the Great Migration, and the South is the route back to Africa for many people to connect with a place they've left behind, but in reality haven't left behind. So it's another example of looking back at the place you're from and kind of reclaiming it. I'm not doing it as, politically or as ideologically as he is, but what I love about that book is it captures a place, and that does it with small vignettes of fiction, poems. There's a play in the end of it, Cadmus, and in each section there's an incomplete circle. When you get through all the sections, the circle is completed, so it has this circular motif to it where it connects the past with the present with all these shared experiences. And that book had a huge influence on me. And the third is Ernest Gaines' his second novel, Of Love and Dust, which he wrote, I think, like in a month and then revised in a month. But it's probably the best first chapter I've read in a book. And he's the reason that I went down to Louisiana. I went down there to study under him. He was somebody that I've grown up reading, and I just loved his economy of language. I loved his portrayal of place, portrayal of people who mattered to him. He was born on a plantation in a slave cabin. It was turned into a sharecropper's cabin. And when he turned 15, he left home and went out to Vallejo, California to live with his stepfather and his mother. For the first time in his life, in 1948, he could go into a library, because in southwest Louisiana and New Roads, he wasn't allowed to go into a library. And so he went to the library and decided he was going to read every book by African Americans living in southwest Louisiana. And so he goes to the library, and they only had 2 books by African Americans, Invisible Man and Native Son. And neither one of those reflected his experience of growing up in the South. So he decided, since there were no books that reflected his experience, he would write those books. And so for him, the act of writing was another act of reclamation, of reclaiming a past and putting words to experience and creating memories on the page that he could dip into and kind of step in and out of. And so that was a revolutionary idea for me when I went down there to study under him. And so that really influenced me. He's certainly my greatest literary influence. He calls Faulkner the old man because he says Faulkner is his greatest literary influence, and Margaret's written about tracing that evolution. And I've told him he's my old man. He doesn't think that's funny or ironic or interesting at all, but he certainly is. I mean, I'm a direct result of reading him. And I think the anxiety of influence is a wonderful thing for writers to suffer under. I think we could all be so lucky to suffer under the work of great writers.
I heard Wiley say last night, I think you said, a poor writer copies, a good writer steals. And I love that, and I thought about it after I left it, because there are 2 things from this book. One is in my first novel, and the other is going to be in my second novel. And this is a preacher. This is another Sunday when I done forget my specs. I'll have to depend, my brother, upon the remembrance for the test. And if y'all wants a snow white tent up yonder in the skies, you better keep the scriptures in your head and not your eyes. I have a preacher in my first novel who says something very similar to that. And when I was reading it over pre-publication, I realized I had stolen from John Charles Mann. And his presence in my life is just amazing. It's woven throughout my life. And the writer, I guess, if I were going to just copy, it would be Flannery O'Connor. I started reading her in the 70s, and then stumbled on the book that I guess is the closest we have to an autobiography, which is her letters with her publisher and friends. Does anybody remember the name of it? It's
The Habit of Being.
The Habit of Being. I've read that at least twice, and I've got dog-eared passages. And, yeah, it's really amazing about the life of a writer. And in it, she talked with her publisher about it took her a year, at least a year, to write a short story. And when I hear of someone writing a novel in a month, I'm just, and you know, it took me 18 years, so I can't grasp that.
Should be mentioned that his editor sent it back to him and said this needs to happen.
Just like Maxwell Perkins did with Scott Fitzgerald with Great Gatsby. And I think he wrote it in less than a year and then revised it, and it was published in, like 2 years. Flannery said about characters, all my stories are about the action of grace on a character who is not very willing to support it. But most people think of these stories as hard, hopeless, and brutal. I've read my collected short stories of hers, and it's got her novels, it's her collected works. And every time I read it, I come away with a different feeling of what she intended, and of that darkness and brutality that's in every one of us. And we won't often look at it, we don't want to see it. So she has hugely influenced me. I read Beloved and I read Song of Solomon, and then I put Morrison aside for a while, and then I tumbled onto The Bluest Sky. I think it was her first. I might not be wrong. I'm right about that. And I just absolutely loved it, and that led me to go on and read more of hers. I guess one of my biggest problems, and it'd be interesting to me to hear if others share this, is a willingness to believe in myself as a writer, and that somebody's going to want to read this. There's always this devil perched on my shoulder that says, this is schlock. Who do you think you are? Nobody's going to want to read this. And sometimes I literally will kind of slap at my shoulder and say, go away, come back tonight when I'm in bed, we can duke it out. But that doubt has plagued me, and when it comes back, I'll stop what I'm doing and go and read somebody I really admire and get my courage back. And that's really what it is, to face the blank screen. I'm in awe of writers who get up every day at 5 o'clock and write 2.5 hours, and then they've got a book in a year. And it doesn't work that way for me. And the visits from the muse are incredibly precious and sometimes too far between. But the doubt, my teacher, the woman to whom my first novel is dedicated, gave me a great gift the night that my book came out. She introduced me. I had been plagued by the thoughts of procrastination. You have to procrastinate. It took 18 years to write a book. And she, in her introduction, turned that P word into another P word. And she said, I persisted. I mean, I almost can't tell it without getting teary-eyed. She said, the demons that plague us are most put off by persistence. So whether it's persisting over 18 years or 18 months is kind of into it. I did persist, and I still am. And I still have those doubts. Thank you.
Both of my parents were excellent storytellers, you know, and I was going to school. My mom would have a porch full of people sitting there, and she would tell me stories, wonderful, wonderful yarns, and my dad was just almost as good, but my mom really was a wonderful storyteller. And so I would, you know, I think I picked up an ear, you know, to hear stories, you know, from her and my father. But, you know, all you would hear today, probably because you are working on something, you know, you're writing something, or you're waiting to get going, or you really got it in your mind to do it. And that's why you're here this morning to pick up the tidbits. And I started late, you know, and I started early, and I had this big pause in between. I was doing all this living stuff. And my daughter, who's got an MFA from a school in Savannah College of Art and Design, screenwriting, she said, Dad, you always said you was a writer, but you never written anything. And that really hit home and made me feel bad, you know. And so, but I was working on some stuff. So then I just had this outpouring of work, you know, like 11 years, you know, 12 plays, but that 4 produced. But they all aren't as finished as some others. But I really just got into it, and it just came out. And the muse that I had was to work with history, you know, like special collections. I was trying to do it just from scratch, just building a play or a story from the bottom up. It just wasn't working for me for years. But once I got on that board, you know, at Emory, you know, I had something I had a foundation to build on. And so, you know, so I tell all you, it's never too late. You know, if you got that story or that poem or that, just whatever it is, you know, you should just go ahead and do it, because it's going to gnaw at you and eat at you. And I heard we were rehearsing a play in Atlanta. We were talking about one of our characters, and someone said, "Well, what would this guy's life be like if he hadn't written this play? And what would your life be like if you hadn't gone through this process? Would you feel like it was something missing, or you let yourself down, or you give it on your own dreams?" So if you have something in you, you just really should pursue it. You know, no matter how long it takes, or no matter what people are saying about you in your face, behind your back, you really have to pursue it, because it's not going to let you alone. And if it's gnawing at you, it means it needs to come out. I think Zora Birches said, nothing is worse than having a book in you that's dying to get out. You know, and so I say all of you that are here, you know, this Saturday morning, you must be here, not just to hear us talk, but because you just need a little more encouragement to do what you have to do.
That seems like a good place to open floor for questions. Unless there's other things to discuss. Questions? John?
Hi, Tony Morrison from Books and the Times. I recall an interview with Tony where she was asked whether there were white characters in the novel. He said, well, why aren't there any black characters in the books? But my Jackson, the well-known black poet, kind of laid down the gauntlet of the challenge and asked, why don't more white poets deal with race in their work? After that, a few years later, a well-known white poet, Tony Hoagland, he wrote a poem that dealt with race, in which it was a persona poem, created a persona. This speaker made derogatory comments, I think, about Venus Williams in the poem. And I was at the AWP conference where a well-known black writer diverted, this is one of the big panels, reading panels, she diverted from the panel and took the opportunity to launch a diatribe against Tony Hoagland having written this poem. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine, Jake Adam York, who's died very recently, was one of the few white male poets in the South writing about race. And he told me that a number of senior white male poets had tried to tell him, stop writing about race, Jake. This is going to be bad for your career, bad for your reputation in the long run. So I just say these things to kind of suggest how brave it is to write about race, especially if you're including characters that are other than you, and how kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. And especially if you cherish your reputation, in your future, your job, all sorts of things are kind of tied into this if you're an academic particularly. So more of a comment than a question, but just to show how hard this whole is.
My PhD is in literature-based creative writing, and my major area is African American literature. So when I went on the job market, he was talking about persistence. We all have it in one way or another. I applied for 104 jobs at colleges and universities. I got 10 interviews, 2 campus visits, and 1 job offer. So my success rate was less than 1%. And I applied for jobs primarily in 3 areas: creative writing, early American literature, and African American literature. And my professors said, man, you don't know what you're getting into. You've kind of got a racially ambiguous name. You're going to go into some of these job interviews, and people aren't going to know who's coming in the door. They're going to be surprised. And I did go in for a couple of interviews where I would go sit down and they would like look to see if anybody else was coming in. Like, you should have mentioned this in your cover letter to us. And so I do think it's interesting when you are writing about race or you are interested in race. No matter what your race is, you almost do have to have a canned answer. Like, well, why are you interested in Ernest Gaines? Why would you ever be interested in that? You don't have to be. And so I do think it's interesting. It's kind of, I don't know if it's damned if you do or damned if you don't, but it is. I think we're geared to expect people to pursue interests that reflect their experience, and I don't think that we should be shackled to do that. And I think that it is interesting to write outside your experience. The old maxim is write what you know. Well, our lives really aren't that exciting, so find out what you don't know. But at the same time, I think you have to pay homage to experiences that are not your own and do a little bit of the extra work. That's something I had a professor at UNC Greensboro, Sally Ann Ferguson, some of y'all might know her. She set me down very early on in my experience of writing about African American literature, and she was like, all right, kid, this is what you got to know. This is what's going to happen. This is what people are going to expect. This is what you need to be prepared, to talk about. And so I do think there's an element of responsibility in covering an experience outside your own, and an expectation that you've done the work and that you've, not taken anything for granted or watched TV or read, Uncle Remus, and so now you think you can talk about whatever you want, So I think that there is a responsibility to inject yourself into those experiences.
2 things that I try to remember to tell people who are wanting to write or currently writing and hoping to publish and become the writer. My first novel was published when I was 71, and my second novel will be published when I'm 75. And I have no formal education. I have a high school education. I used to be ashamed of that. There were no letters after my name. And I think it is much more difficult now in terms of finding employment to go and not have an advanced degree or an undergraduate degree. But as I was coming up, it wasn't as difficult as it is now. But don't think it's too late. That's my biggest message. Do not think it's too late. If you've got something to write, write it, and it'll be heard. It won't if you don't.
Charles Dickens sort of did it for me growing up because, there was a lot of books on, not a lot of books, there were books about, James Baldwin had other books out of the period. But to read about, what Charles Dickens was writing about and how white people were mistreating white people, it was a relief for me. So I thought, so everybody was getting and so that was a real relief. It made me see things differently, so everybody not having a real one time about this. I had a play of mine in a conference in Valdez, Alaska, and it got accepted. So I had to go to Alaska. So I was the only black guy up there, and it was in the summertime. So I heard Long John thinking it was going to be cold. So I flew into Anjail, rented a car, and drove down to Valdez, just where the oil spill was. And so this conference was really hosted by Edward Albee, who wrote, other thing. He was there, Tony Kushner was there, and Lloyd Birches, who directed all of the Wilson plays, was there, and Courtney Vance, the actor, Martha Bassett, and Laura Linney's father was there, Ronald Linney. So we had all these playwrights up here in Alaska, and they had actors too, but Patricia Neal was there, the actress. So it was, right here for a whole week of this, and they were reading your stuff and dissecting it, and telling you. So it really made me feel good to be accepted up there. So Tony Kushner was there, and he was talking, this was years ago, he was talking about working on the Lincoln Project then. And Kushner and I think Arthur Wilson had a little dispute about something. Arthur Wilson said he didn't think white writers should write about race, black race, And Kushner, had written a play called Caroline, So they were going back and forth with that. And that topic came up during this conference in Alaska. And I think most of us came to the conclusion that, the human experience is the human experience, and people all have sensibilities. I have a Jewish character in my play, and I thought I might be offending Jewish people, so I encouraged my play to the Holocaust Center in Atlanta, because I was just make sure I was accurate. I didn't want to, overdo it or underdo it. So I encouraged the people, and they read it and gave me their comments, and I encouraged another group, and they were reading through the comments. Then I realized that this is going forever. I had to cut it off somewhere. It just take my lumps where they fall. And the people came out and they, for the most part, enjoyed my character. They know it was the best I could do with what I had. So I think so whatever you're working on, if you're passionate about it and your heart's in it, because I have female characters, and you try to do the best you can, and some playwrights can say better with women characters than others, and so I try to be. I have 4 sisters, so it did help a lot, But so you have to write outside your experience. You just have to, if you want to write characters.
Do that research.
Do research.
Regarding procrastination and the voices that come in, the critical voice. When I was a graduate student in New York, we had a wonderful workshop with the poet Bob Potts, and he let us pick his brain. And that was a question that came up. What do you do about all these voices that go on? You're trying to write and you can't for all the voices. He said, well, they just want to be loved. Just write down what they're saying and they'll shut up. They just want some attention. So he sent us out on a writing assignment to go wherever we were going to go and come back at some later point. So I went to my apartment because it was all set up, because you have to have money to sit down in New York City. You just can't go sit. So I had this disturbing dream, and that content kept filtering through my mind. I couldn't really pay attention to much else because of that. So I went home, got in front of the computer, and started up working out the dream content. And this voice said, I can't believe you're going to say that. And so I wrote it down. And then, as soon as I wrote it down, that voice went away, the poem started up. And that's how I got the poem down the page. Every time that voice would crank up with something critical, I'd write it down, it would go in the background, and the poem would come back. And he said, look at it when you're done. If it doesn't work, you can cut it out. But a lot of times it serves as it can be a point of counterpoint, and it can remain. So there's something powerful about writing that down. I have the workshop I do with writers called the Gift of the Fearless Writer, and have an exercise where you interview that voice. You interrogate it, and you might find some surprising things, some insights as to where that came from. Sometimes those voices come from some place early in childhood. Somebody has said something to you. Someone has indicated what your limits are. And it's funny how this stuff comes up when you're trying to write. Everything, that whole vault opens up. So there are ways to get a handle on it and make it sometimes work for you.
Questions? Other questions? Mary?
You guys talked about how younger children is more about fairness. I think that's true, but there's a danger in that, in a way, and not looking at the past and not seeing race and not unfairness. And, I think some of the racism in the New South, much of it is so insidious. And there's a way that we need to have a more critical eye to see it, especially if we're not experiencing it firsthand. So I'm curious how you dealt with that in your own writing, especially if you're writing from the white point of view. And then also contemporary Southern writers who are maybe tackling that subtlety, you think, well. I would be curious.
Yeah, I think it's Jesse Jackson who said during the civil rights era, it's easy to point to racism because you just sit on different spots on the bus, but it's harder to point to it in a boardroom where everybody sits at the same table, But it doesn't mean it's not there. So I think one way to tackle it is just talk about the inconsistency of it. And like what I was trying to do with the Confederate flag, and the father says, I don't know what it means, but it doesn't mean that. I'm pretty sure it doesn't mean that. I don't know, but I got it on my truck. I don't think it means that. And it's just what do we do with these images, and what do we mean when we say things, And there's a lot of inconsistency. There are some Southern writers who are tackling this and trying to do different things. I think that help. For example, I don't know if the author was trying to tackle issues of race or just present the world as she knew, but the help got a lot of people talking about things that nobody talked about in a long time. Issues of white writers writing in dialect. That was a big deal. Her writing about her own past. Was a big deal. There's a new novel coming out. I'm not quite sure of the title of it. Another writer is Colson Whitehead, who does a lot of things with race. I just read his novel, John Henry Days, which is about this town in West Virginia owning John Henry, who was this ex-slave who built the C&O tunnel. It's a beautiful novel. And there's a new novel by a guy named Geronimo Johnson about these I think college students from Stanford who go to Louisiana for a Confederate reenactment, and they stage a lynching to be ironic, and it goes horribly wrong. It's this group of friends. And so I think a lot of, contemporary Southerners are asking these hard questions.
I just had one other thought. This doesn't really speak directly to your question, but when I mentioned 18 years on my book, I also known other writers who had a problem knowing when to stop, when to say it's finished. And just about 6 months or a year before I finally decided to put paid to it, I heard Picasso in an interview shortly before he died asked about how do you know when a work of art is finished. And he said, I don't finish a work of art, I abandon it. And I think that's so true. We're abandoning our characters. And we're saying, okay, you're on your own now. Go live.
Hi, I just want to say how happy I am to be here today. This is my first ever literary event. I just went I went to college when I turned 60. And before that, I had mind-numbing jobs like everybody else has had. When I went back to school, all these thoughts and ideas just started bam, 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 bam. And I was writing constantly. Well, I'm still writing constantly. I love poetry. And I'm writing, a lot of my poems now are about Vietnam, because that was the era. I didn't go to Vietnam, but I got lots of letters from friends from Vietnam. And a lot of them are just, it's hard sometimes, very hard to sit down and write about this without becoming very emotional. And I want to know if there's a character that you've ever done that just, you just had to put it down because the emotions that were gripping you were just too much to bear almost.
I worked on a play called Birches, and I just moved from Atlanta to New York City, and just started on getting my work into bigger stages. So I wrote a play called Birches, and it was about J. Marion Sims and his statue was Institute Park, 103rd and 5th Avenue. He was a doctor who was a physician in the 1940s in Montgomery, Alabama, in South Carolina. He's the father of Monterey College. And so part of his, I guess his circuit was taking care of enslaved people, mostly women on plantations around Montgomery. He inherited practice from someone else, another doctor, who went off, started being a planter. Alabama, then the Pacific frontier in the West. And so Dr. Sims took over practice and take care of a lot of women on the plantations. And so a lot of them were having a problem with giving birth because they were going to die before and the work was pretty strenuous. And so they were having, some were having difficult deliveries. And they were having this little folks, they were having cherubs. So they were bring them glad of cherubs. So they give them up these awful odors and whatnot. So, and there was really nothing to do to fix this. So these owners felt like that's not a property. No one could go near them, and they couldn't work, and they were just, some of them would be commit suicide. Just had their own smells. So Sims took on himself and said, "It's not to fix this," So he was a gifted surgeon, a white doctor, and he was started making an instrument, speculum, he did it first time, started doing these things, and he started sewing the ladies up. He used wire, and there was nothing to numb the pain, so he gave them opium. So the more they gave opium, the more he would, they still had leakage. So this play was very, very hard for me to write, and we did it in Atlanta, we did it in New York City, in East Village, and the people there were just, and it was hard. I could write a little bit, not stop and do that. And so then the Civil War came about, and Sims went to Europe, even his heart was in Dixie, and so he sold his practice went to Europe. But he had developed these skills so well that he was operating on royalty in Europe. Holy Third wife worked on was his grandmother, after surgery. So his statue is in New York City in Central Park. So I wrote a play about his statue is there. He kept very good records on three ladies, Betsy, Anasha, and Lucy. So I have their spirits coming back around his statue to give their account of what went down from their point of view. Then the statue comes alive to defend himself, And so that was a very hard place for me to write. And I have some songs in between. I have some songs about Odetta and some other people. And at the end of the play, and also there's a young man in the play who's related to one of these spirits. He has the ability to be a doctor, but he's dumbing Nasha, who's the youngest of these ladies. She's 17. And all these women had 34 surgeries, you know, during this period. And so, through this 40 period. And so they come back and talk to him about, you know, he could have freed them, you know, they were back to the field and died soon after. But, so this young man is dumbing himself down and fit into the other crowd. It's a Marley play. And it's a rescue mission also. He's doing a report on Dr. Simmons, you know, for his biology class. And they come back, and so the play deals with that. And so that was very heartbreaking, right? And, because it was just a lot to deal with.
What's the title of the play?
Damaged Virtue. And it's, but at the ending, it's uplifting. You know, it's not sad. You know, it doesn't sound horrible, but at the end, you know, Anjail, who hadn't spoken almost 200 years, at the end, this young man decided to go back to school, and he's going to live up to his, talent. And then all the ladies start singing at the end the South African song, "Something Inside So Strong," and then Anjail, who hadn't spoken in 200 years, she lets out this loud scream of joy, and then everybody sort of, you know, kind of start crying a little bit, you know. So it's uplifting. I know it sounds, you got to get there though. You know? That was hard for me to write. Yeah.
There was a great book several years ago, and I'm sure everybody knows about it, called Medical Apartheid. Did you read that? And it was about Sims and many of these were like experiments, really. He was experimenting on these enslaved women to ready himself for the master's wife, for the royalty, and these were women whose bodies were sacrificed for, you know, the modern technology of gynecological care. So it's just an amazing history when you delve into it. How many times these enslaved people or people of color were literally used as medical subjects. In the South, after, you know, people who would go to debtor's prison or die in debtor's prison, oftentimes before their bodies were put in debtor's graves, they were used as medical experiments in gross anatomy and things like that. And then there were laws created where the bodies couldn't be used without consent. And so many medical schools in the South would employ what they call resurrection men, where they would dig up, they go into African American cemeteries and dig up freshly buried African American bodies to use in these experiments because they knew nobody would care about them. And there's instances of medical schools in the Deep South being moved and then digging up the foundations and finding hundreds of bodies and hundreds of bones where they were secreting these people away in the middle of the night. It's just this incredibly macabre history that I'd love to read that play. Obviously not love to read that play, but I'd be very interested in that play because it's the history that we don't know about. You know, these medical advances had to come from somewhere.
And I ask people after the play, you know, what they think, what simple, good guy, bad guy, and it's probably someone will say medical advances were developed from some of this, so, and it benefited from it today, so it's really a interesting,
And that's all we have time for. Thank you to the panel.